While we wait for Mr. McAfee's grace to join our presence, we would like to invite Vlad to start sharing his story with us. So thank you, Vlad.
Hi there. I'm Vlad, and I have no idea if there is any way to get a better booking than this to be the opening act for John McAfee and for Adam Back. I mean, this is my first presentation at a Bitcoin-related conference. I have done some academic stuff, but nothing related to Bitcoin. I'm a bit nervous, and I have decided for this presentation to focus on something which zooms out on what we usually focus on and think about the people around us, like the cameraman who was watching us talk about Bitcoin for 3 days in a row. And I was thinking yesterday, what is on his mind? Like, what are these people doing just talking about Bitcoin? Are they fanatics? Are they like a cult? Are they trying to overthrow the system to their crazy ideas? And I was thinking, how can you explain Bitcoin to somebody in terms of value proposition? Okay, let me figure out how this works. Do I have a laser pointer?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So how do I explain this in terms of value proposition so that anyone can understand and see why would anyone step on stage and speak about Bitcoin in Romania? And for this, I appealed to the history that I know in terms of finances and in terms of inflation and confiscation that happened in Romania. And in order to make a stronger case, I appealed to my family members. And for 3 generations, my family has been subjected to confiscation of wealth, and then inflation, hyperinflation, and lots of abuses from the government that should not happen in a system which has sound money. I think this is ultimately the value proposition that Bitcoin has, and for this we can say that Bitcoin fixes this, because otherwise we just look like lunatics and nerds to outsiders who might be watching on live stream. So, first slide. Okay. I focused on Bitcoin's value proposition, and to regular people it's about store of value. But personally, I think that this whole narrative of store of value is not very true, in the sense that gold is a better store of value. Bitcoin is more effective and more efficient in terms of transferring value and storing it without a physical quality that can be confiscated. And this leads to the unconfiscatable and uncensorable qualities of Bitcoin. Because really, when you store gold in your house, like it was the case of that Chinese business person, you're exposed to a lot of risks. And you turn yourself into a honeypot for attackers who will find out that you have a lot of stuff stored in your house, and it might be a safe, but they can crack it. It might be a third party, but they can find their way into it. So whatever is physical can be stolen by malevolent actors, can be inflated by the government if it's in the form of money or other products that the government can produce, and can be taxed by your government. So Bitcoin is effective in this regard just because it has these qualities. And I'll get to the next slide. Why would anyone care about uncensorable and unconfiscatable sound money? Because central banking isn't always efficient at balancing supply and demand. And in the case of Romania and lots of Eastern European countries, we see lots of statements with central bankers who say everything is under control. We have figured out how to have the proper amount of inflation. Not too little, not too much, just enough to stimulate the market, to help banks give credits, and all sorts of stuff. What we have seen in 2008 and 2009, that all these predictions and all these plans basically crashed and burned, and we all suffered. And at the end of the day, we ended up having debts, individual I mean, because we bailed out the banks. And it will be us who pays for all of this experimental fiat money mumbo jumbo, I don't know how I should call it. It's all uncertain, and nobody has any idea what they're doing, even though they pretend that they are in such a high position and they're governors of the central bank. And countries around the world suffer from this arbitrary and abusive confiscation and hyperinflation. We can see the case of Venezuela right now. I think let me think of another example, because that's the most typical in this community. But in Romania, which will be presented, there were many cases of hyperinflation which are quite scandalous because we don't think about it. It was 20 years ago, and we maybe forgot because our lives got steadily better. But I'll get to that slide anyway. So economic rights are also threatened even in the most democratic countries. And this is also one of the value propositions of Bitcoin, because with bank accounts, the bank, when you stop paying your loan, they can just freeze your account, which means even if you have like $10 in your account, you cannot go buy groceries, you cannot withdraw. Your money is frozen there until the moment when you pay your debt, which doesn't work like that with cash. If you have cash in your pocket, you return it when you can actually afford the debt. But until then, you can eat, you can pay your rent, and you can function as a human being until that very point. And I think that with too much power given to the banks, we will end up to this system where they can just do whatever they want, because governments will just endlessly grant them freedoms and the possibility to take on more data processing, and they will give them more power over the clients, which I don't think is fair and is fine. The checks and balances are gone, and sometimes the bankers are the ones who finance the politicians' campaigns, so they end up just like we have in Romania right now, with a candidate who pretends to be reformist and everything, who says that every spending that is more expensive than 2,000 lei, which means $450, should not be made in cash. And if you want to buy something which is more expensive than $450, then you have to do it with your bank account, with your credit card and stuff like that, so you can be tracked, so they can know what you bought, when you bought it, for which amount. They know how much money you have. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fine. And that comes not from the neo-communists who used to rule our country and used to be in government until 2 days ago. This comes from the new party, which pretends to bring new ideas. And I think that banking should be kept in check with something that comes from the outside, which happens to be Bitcoin in this case, because it's the best invention that we have. Does this work? I pressed too many times. Okay, so the case of Romania, because this is from where I started. They say that the formation of Romania took place in 1862, when they basically acknowledged the union between Wallachia and Moldavia, the two historic regions. And I think this is boring for most people, and I will try to get over it and get to the most interesting part very fast. But in 1863 and 1864, they have what we were taught in school, the reformist measures by ruler Cuza, who said that it's good to secularize the wealth of the churches, to basically create a national church instead of having many private churches, and also confiscated everything that used to belong to the noble class and give it to the peasants who were working the lands. And maybe that this was necessary in that point because the centralization of power was huge, and maybe that we as a state were able to grow and develop a capitalist model after this authoritarian move. I'm not sure. Maybe that it's wrong to judge with my current values something that happened more than 150 years ago. But what I do know is that in 1948, when the communists came, and that's 71 years ago, that's not such a long time ago. My grandmother used to remember it. And she saw how banks were nationalized, the industry was collectivized, resources were given to the state. And this didn't just happen in Romania. It happened in all the Eastern Bloc countries, as after World War II, we were basically declared on the side of Russia to be integrated into the USSR agenda. And all the countries ended up having communist regimes, which declared that wealth and everything that you owned should go to the state to be redistributed. And it was abusive, and I'm going to present you some clear cases on it. And also around the time, there was the collectivization, which meant that peasants, which made up about 70–80% of the population, were pushed and were forced with deportation, with lots of abusive, physically abusive measures to give away everything that they have, from the lands which they received in 1864, and all the way to the animals that they had in their yards, to the wealth they had and everything else. And inflation in Romania is kind of a funny topic, because nowadays you hear the governor of the central bank say, we have the inflation in check and it's not very bad and there's nothing that can go wrong. But in 1991, it was 170%, and the peak of it was in 1993, which is 1 year after I was born, to 56.1%, which is scandalous. And I'm going to present to you a case where basically the amount of money that could buy a car ended up buying a couch. And this is a lot worse, if you ask me, than buying Bitcoin in December 2017 at 20,000 and then waiting until December 2018 when it was 3,500 or something. So you can see the inflation rate, and nowadays I think it's around 4%, but it's still not enough to incentivize you to save. And these are my family members. That's my grandmother on the left, and she was the daughter of Iane, who was Greek, who was a butcher, and he had a small Iane had a small butcher shop, and they basically lost everything when the communists came in 1948. They had an extra house, they had this business, and she was declared to be an enemy of the state. And her husband, Flora, who was the son of Stefan, was also the son of a business owner who had a carpentry and glass window business. And he lost everything after confiscation. And for a few years, he was not allowed to finish his studies and graduate high school, because once again, he was an enemy of the state. He was not from, we used to say it the cin sănătoase, which means healthy roots. They wanted everybody to be from a very peasant and poor class to be promoted in communism, which most of the times it meant uneducated, and it's also the reason why in the first few years they ended up promoting in ministry and high governmental places all sorts of people who did not even know how to read. And they were just given orders and told what to do, and they would just execute. And around the time in the 1940s, 1950s, it was also when the elites, I mean the intellectuals of Romania, had to either flee the country or go to the kind of forced labor camps that we had. And the salt mine that you saw today was the result of decades of political prisoners who were pushed to work. I'm not sure if you know that, but also this and the one from Slănic Prahova are the results of forced labor during the communist era. Maybe not all of them were intellectuals, but if you were committing any type of crime against the regime, they would send you to a camp of forced labor, which was even worse in Russia by comparison, because they would send you to Gulag, and God only knows what happened there, because the crimes of communism, unlike the crimes of fascism and Nazism, were never judged by any international court. So we carry that burden, and we seem to forget too easily that it was only 70 years ago that this happened. And this is my father. He doesn't like to be in pictures, but in 1989, in November, he had the wedding with my mother. And you know that weddings are basically fundraisers where young couples receive amounts of money to start a new life, maybe buy a house, move into a place of their own. And they wanted to buy a car, which was a Dacia, which is a very bad car, but it was the only one that they could get at the time. And even if they had the money, they could not buy it, because the system made you deposit the money and then be on a waiting list. And you had to wait up to 2 years to get your car, which is insane. Nowadays, you just go to the dealership and you even get your car without paying anything, because it's on credit and you become the slave of the banks for 20 years or something. But around that time, they deposited this money, and the 90s came, the revolution came, and they were caught off guard, and they realized that they were not getting any car. So they tried to get their money back, and by the time they got their money back, the inflation has pretty much destroyed the value of that money, so that they bought the couch on which I slept as a child with the money that they raised during the wedding to buy a car, which is really sad if you think about it. And this is just a personal example, so you empathize a little bit, because I suppose there are millions of people who were a lot worse off. And the 90s were very harsh in Romania, and I guess lots of countries in the Eastern Bloc, because I remember we used to live in an apartment which had 3 rooms, 2 dormitories and 1 living room. But during winter, the central heating, which was affecting all the neighborhoods in the city, was so bad that we had to sleep the entire family of 4 in 1 room so we could heat it properly and not feel cold. And these experiences are not maybe presented to the extent that they deserve. And the government will always say that everything is fine and you should trust their currency and you should not worry that maybe last year euro was 4.5 lei and now it's 4.75, which is a lot by central banking standards. And they will say you that it's okay to get a loan because everything works, and it's not going to happen like in 2008 when a lot of people got a credit from the bank and they ended up not being able to pay it back, or they got the loan in Swiss francs and the amount doubled within a few years. And between 2007 and 2015, Romania had the 2nd highest growth of emigration rate after Syria. And if you think about it, Syrians fled their country because there is a war. There's the Bashar al-Assad government, which works against their own people and drops tear gases, and they try to intimidate the opposition and impose by force. But in the case of Romania, people willingly left the country. And nowadays there are 19 million of us, but it's uncertain how many of us are still in the country, because if you talk to anyone, they have at least 1 or 2 relatives who are abroad working. And it's uncertain whether or not they will be returning, because the trust in government is so low that a lot of people said it's not even worth it to change, because the 90s, the early 2000s, there were a lot of people who basically came from the United States after they stood there during the communist era, and they came back and said, I can reform the country, I know how capitalism works, and maybe that we can build a more prosperous country. But in reality, we ended up being governed by the same people from the old system who only wanted to enrich themselves and destroy pretty much everything which was about industry and pump their own bags, to speak in specific terms. And right now, the inflation rate in Romania is about 4% every year, which is still not enough to incentivize you to save anything, because an average commercial bank gives you about 2% return, interest, and you also have to deal with fees, and pretty much all of our economy right now is based on spending and consumption. And I read somewhere that 40% of the world's capital is being traded on Wall Street, which means that during the next financial crisis, the rest of the world is going to be hit a lot harder than before. And the fact that we don't have any kind of industry and we base our economy specifically on the fact that people spend their money, that's dangerous, because the moment when people will not have money to spend and will want to save, the whole system collapses. And that's why I got into Bitcoin in the first place. It didn't make much sense in 2014 when I heard about it, because I was a student, I didn't have enough money. At the time, there was still the Silk Road stigma. And I just thought to myself, is this for me, really? And the answer was no. But when I started making money for myself, and I got to the point in my life where I had to consider the options, and the only option that you have as a young person in Romania, if you want to buy a house, is not to save, because you're going to lose money, but to get a loan from the bank. But that means that for 30 years, which is pretty much your entire professional life, you're going to pay back. But you don't have any kind of guarantee that you're going to have a job. You don't have any kind of guarantee that you're going to have money to pay it all the time, which brings penalties in itself and subjects you to all sorts of unpleasant situations about which young people don't think. We are all reckless. We think that if we got a well-paying job, then we're going to hold on to it for the rest of our lives and we're going to work it out. But the world economy doesn't really care about our expectations and our wishes. And we also have an increasing debt per capita. And every citizen on average has to pay about $4,000 to the government to become solvent pretty much. But the average monthly salary, no, the minimum wage right now is $400 a month, which really isn't much. And I didn't put the graph in this because I did the presentation last night, but the debt per capita is increasing, and I think since 2010 it has tripled, and there's no trend which shows that it's going down at any point in the future. So if you're Romanian and have been subjected to all of these experiences, then it makes some sense to invest. This is not financial advice, by the way, but to own some Bitcoin and hold it just in case, just if the financial system doesn't serve your interests anymore. And yeah, Romania is not even the only case, because all the countries under the political influence of the USSR have had to deal with this, but Romania is one of the worst because we have had incompetent and corrupt politicians. I looked up Poland, for example, and they were able by 1995 to stabilize inflation and not have any of the crazy dynamics of the market that we had in the 90s in Romania. And Poland right now is a champion of European industry, and they have lots of small businesses and lots of big European corporations which produce in Poland, which Romania doesn't really have. We don't sustain our economy with anything. And I also looked up Bulgaria, which often is the example with which Romania gets compared, because they are our neighbors, and sometimes we like to make fun of them because they're poorer and they have fewer resources and they do worse in metrics. But actually they have a better record with inflation than we have, which should make us all think. It's a smaller country, sure, it's easier to govern, but they have done a better job at economics than we have. And incompetence and corruption are common all across the region. It's just inescapable. You see new people coming all the time making promises about making politics better. I myself used to be involved in politics. I graduated from a university with a degree in political science, and I tried to run as an independent for the mayor of my hometown, got 6.5%. Which was disappointing for me, but people encouraged me and said, no, you should do this like for 20 years, every election cycle to run, and then people will vote you in office. But in the meantime, I realized that it doesn't matter who you elect into office, because there is a bureaucratic apparatus that is always there and will always stand in your way no matter what. Will always have its own agenda. Sometimes there are people who have been corruptively and abusively hired there to represent somebody else's interest. And in here, at least, we have a test when you get the job. We say that if you pass that test, then you're competent and nobody can fire you unless you have some kind of very strong violation of the rules. And most of these people have been hired with a test that has been arranged because they received the answers before. It happens in this country. And they end up basically retiring on that position and representing the same interest. So even if you step into the system and you try to change it from within, you're not going to go very far, because you find these people who have all the interest because they received a lot of money and their jobs depend on it, to stop you and throw mud at you and destroy you and tarnish your reputation, which is how politics works. But now we have Bitcoin as an external form of money, which is non-governmental, is not controlled by or manipulated by any corrupt government. It is manipulated in terms of price action. I can agree with that. There are whales which maybe do pumps and dumps, but that only happens with new inventions in financial markets which have very low liquidity. And as more liquidity gets into the game, it's not going to matter as much if somebody with $10 million decides to suddenly buy. There's not going to be a spike. It's going to be much more stable. We're not going to see as many gains. And that store of value function is going to be so much better than it currently is. And right now, I don't own a lot of Bitcoin because I got in too late, but I see it as a way of hedging against this system, which I dislike. It's my way of protesting against the government without actually being in front of the government palace every day and holding a banner, because I have done that for a while and it doesn't work. They don't care. They find ways to divert you. They find ways to make you doubt your cause. And Bitcoin fixes this. So thank you. No questions?
All right, we've got some questions. Here we go.
Bam, phone, dead. Good presentation. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. I thought someone else would be speaking. What I want to tell you is, in Romania, we don't really have financial education. People don't understand, for example, what investing in a company is all about, owning shares, fractionalizing that. They don't have the knowledge. And I personally trained 6,000 freelancers, taking people from being a slave in a corporation to being financially independent and working with clients and building their own reputation. And even there, I found a lot of resistance towards the idea of Bitcoin. Like, I could count on my two hands the people that I managed to convince to accept Bitcoin as a payment for their freelancing services. But that was a couple of years ago, and I think if we can get people in Romania to understand the intrinsic value of Bitcoin, then we could actually, we could jumpstart, instead of going through financial education as in shares in companies, going through financial education as in, working with crypto assets and forward. And what's your experience on that?
I don't trust national education anymore. I can agree that to some extent it can be great, and it has done a great job with me, but I turned against it. But I don't think the purpose of national education is to teach you to think. It's just to put some facts in your head, and you're going to point them out whenever somebody tries to debate with you. And that's pretty much it. It's useful to get a job. I can agree with that. But other than that, you're supposed to do some sort of personal research. And I don't think any kind of government teaches you how to overthrow it. Really, it doesn't give you that kind of education. Only if you don't agree with it, you're going to acquire that type of knowledge. And I can appreciate the fact that at least I live in a society where I can protest and where I can express my opinion, and I don't have any kind of physically oppressive force aligned right here to take me. So the fact that we are able to consider an alternative to government money, and the fact that we can debate on it, is really impressive. And I appreciate it, but we can do it better than this. And in regards to freelancers not accepting Bitcoin, well, yeah, it might be due to the volatility and the fact that they might need to spend it. If you explain to them that they can dump the coins on one exchange whenever they receive them, then it can work. But I guess human nature makes us just speculate. And when we get paid in Bitcoins for something, or we get a tip in Bitcoin, we're going to say, oh, I need to buy this for myself, or I need to pay my rent, but what if I wait until tomorrow? Maybe by tomorrow I'll be richer. And if I'm not richer by tomorrow and I lose value, then how about I wait another day? This happens.
Hi, Vlad, here on the right, left, right, somewhere. Thank you for the presentation. I actually agreed on Roxana's point as well, but I wanted to ask the same question, but then I realized what actually happened in India. The only way you can really engage the youth is by aggressively creating communities and meetups. That's the only way to make it work. It has to be free. It has to be every week. It has to be every single week for like 1, 2, 3 years. Yes, so you know that. And in India today we have 1.3 billion people, and Bitcoin is officially banned. You cannot use your bank instruments or any kind of payments to buy Bitcoin. But if you see the crypto awareness in India is extremely high. It's insane. Like everybody knows what's going on. But on the same line, are there something like those happening like what she did? Or are there any communities run by students? If not, I think that's the best option.
I agree that meetups can be great, but I have come to the conclusion personally that if people need Bitcoin in their lives, they're going to find it. There are so many educational resources up to this point that anyone can find a podcast or a book or anything else to educate themselves and understand it. If we try to evangelize and promote it to people who are otherwise closed-minded and they will not listen at all, then that's a waste of energy. And it also makes us be insufferable and makes us look like some kind of smug who tells them, oh, the central banking doesn't work, so you should dump your fiat. I used to do that. I realized that people don't like me, and I just allow them. They know what I do. My friends know what I do, and if any one of them wants to invest into Bitcoin, they come to me, and I usually tell them just get some, don't buy much more than you can afford. Don't get a loan to buy Bitcoins thinking that you're going to speculate and get rich. I know that Mr. Hodl did that, but it's a huge risk, and I'm not going to advise anyone to do it. And just wait 10 to 5 years. Forget about it. Don't get involved too much. If you're a working professional, don't turn your life into this because it will not make you happy. Just forget about it for 5 years and then see what happens. If you think it's still good, then keep on holding on to it. But it's a long-term game.
Thank you. Is he here? All right. All right, thanks, Vlad. Next up, we have Theo Goodman with a panel about toxic. And what does it say? Shitcoin. Oh, no. Are you sure? All right. Theo's going to sit down. Wrecked again.
Sorry, it's my turn.
And now, of course, a man who needs no introduction. Former presidential candidate, the inventor of McAfee antivirus. Is he there? No. I didn't think so. A man who made a very big bet on Bitcoin, big supporter of cryptocurrencies, wants to end the drug war, Libertarian Party candidate, worked for Xerox and NASA, helped design the graphical user interface, traveled the 7 seas, hunted Moby Dick, fought Captain Ahab, killed Polonius. Nope. Oh, it's just me again. I don't know. We're out of things to say. I read the whole Wikipedia entry. Like all of it.